Good afternoon, everyone. This is Christina Osborne with Stakeholder Affairs. First, I want to apologize for the delay. We were having issues getting into the web conference, so I do apologize, and thanks for your patience. I'd like to welcome you to the part one of the ADS user interface replacement training. With me on the phone from ISO, we have Diana Adesani, John Williams, Akam Ferdo, and also Gina Wanzer, who's actually going to be presenting. We will pause throughout the training for questions, so you can either raise your hand by pressing #2, or if you're more comfortable, you're welcome to send your question or your comment to me via chat, and I'll make sure that I read it out loud to everybody. What I'll do is I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Gina so we can get started, because I know we're a little behind.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for your patience, as Christina mentioned. Sorry, Christina, did you already do your introduction?
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. Okay. Introduce everybody, but yeah, you can introduce yourself again. That's fine.
Okay. Yeah. No. So I'm Gina Wanzer. I am a client trainer here with Customer Readiness Group. You may have heard me on other trainings, but today I'll be covering ADS UI replacement project and then some of the things associated with that. Okay, so for the objectives for today's training, after this training, you should be able to identify upcoming dates, changes, and some actions that are needed for the transition into the new ADS UI planned for fall of 2020 or this year. You'll be able to describe some of the changes that are related to the transition, including in the UI. So we're going to be talking about the layout and login, and then some basic navigation and functionality within that new application. And we'll cover some steps that are similar to what maybe you're doing today, or doing it in the new UI. And then we'll talk about next training that's available. And how to locate the various reference material for additional information, okay? So let's just do a quick stop on what is ADS so you know if you're in the right place or not. The automated dispatch system on the UI is used to view market dispatch instructions provided by the real-time market. You can use this to view the dispatch instructions, including dispatch operating targets. I know for some settlements folks, they also use this for the dispatch operating points. You can view commitment instructions, ancillary service instructions, as well as critical ISO real-time messages, and some of the historical data with all of that. So if that does not apply to you, you might not be in the right place today. But if it does, then welcome to the ADS UI replacement. So like I said, in today's training, we're going to get familiar with that new UI so that folks can participate in the application preview and in the market sim. If you've been in the RUG or the release user group, you may have heard of this application preview. It's basically early access for ADS users to preview the new user interface before we jump into market sim. It's really going to be early access to the core replacement, or the replacement of the functionality that you have today in today's ADS. So that application preview is going to take place in stage. And so if you're interested in participating in that, you'll have to work with your user access administrator to get access to that. To get more information as far as the ADS replacement project and the requirements go, I just wanted to make sure that you have access to the business requirement specifications, which are on the release planning site on our website. And today we're going to focus on these specific requirements. So we'll talk about the initial set of BRQs, which are associated with the actual replacement itself from the current to the new web SDK platform. Then we'll talk a little bit about how to query the operating messages via ADS, so we'll include that in this one, and the enhanced visibility of those messages. And then we'll cover this requirement as well, which is the fact that you can maintain access to the data for about 30 days. So the query is going to be limited to 30 days. We'll talk about that. Okay. The future training, which is the ADS UI replacement training part 2, as well as the DOT tariff clarification project training and the IDS or intertie deviation settlement training. Those will be covered in future trainings. So we'll talk about things like displaying the FMM schedules for intertie resources and alarm associated with that. We'll talk about the flex ramp up and down binding awards and how that's going to look in ADS as well. We'll also include the unannounced ancillary service testing moving into ADS. I think currently, if you are familiar with that process, that happens verbally. And then for ISOBA as well, the real-time contingency dispatch instructions, what that's going to look like, in particular as it relates to non-spin, and then addition of a couple columns. And then for those of you who are heavily involved in the DOT tariff clarification project, we'll cover the operating instruction changes in that training. So just wanted to give you guys a heads up of what's coming in July. Now, some notable changes in order to prepare for the ADS transition going into the new UI and the new API. So these notable changes may require your entity to look at how you're operating today and what you might need to change. So from the API change standpoint, that'll be coming with the fall 2020 project releases, and the enhancements will be implemented in the version 8. Now, the plan for the fall release, once that is live, is to support version 7 and version 8. So if you're using version 6, you'll need to look at moving to version 7 or version 8. Version 6 will be deprecated upon release of the version 8. Now, the tech specs have been posted on developer.kaiso.com under the ADS section. And if you want to review what the technical user group talked about in relation to that, I recommend that you visit the technical user group section in the KAISO website. There's a link here, which includes both the recording and the presentation for that. So we're not going to talk about API today. That's more of a technical user group discussion. So if you are interested in those changes and what's coming, I recommend you take a look at these documents and resources. Okay. So another set of notable changes which might require some adjustment. So the query tool data export currently is planned for reduced data retention to 30 days, and this will be in Excel format only, both CSV and XLS. So you may need to look at how you're saving that data and how often. Let's see, for logging in, using the recommended and supported browsers. So we're going to be supporting Chrome and Edge with Chromium. It's not in current scope to support the Internet Explorer browser. I've heard people ask about Firefox, and that's also not in the scope of supporting. So just something to note that you'll need one of these two browsers. And then the third thing is it'll be accessible from the market participant portal. So today you actually install an application onto your desktop. You have a series of steps related with your certificate. That's not going to be the same anymore. It'll be accessible from market participant portal. So if today you're going to Cyber or another application of ours like OMS through the market participant portal, you'll be able to do that with ADS moving into this version. Okay. I'm going to do 2 more slides and then I'll stop for questions. And I'm kind of trying to speed through this so we have enough time for the user interface. So let's just talk about some of the upcoming dates and things that you should be doing as you move into the coming month or in the current month as an example. So we did do a review of the access transition. So what it means when we're transitioning into the new ADS UI, what it means for your user access administrators, and what that's going to look like. So that was covered on June 1st, and they should be working on transitioning that access if it's needed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But again, for the application preview, if you want to participate in that early access to ADS and looking at just the current functionality in the new UI, you'll need access to Stage. So if you want access to that, you'll need to reach out to your user access administrator, and that's the person who gives you your certificate. So I would reach out to them. Another thing you should be doing is reviewing the market simulation scenarios and providing any feedback and requests. The requests are due July 3rd. There's certain structured scenarios which are going to require some more specific information to generate those scenarios. So you'll need to review those scenarios and submit your requests by July 3rd. If you need more information on this, reference the June 2nd release user group meeting and the release planning site to view the market simulation scenarios. And then the third thing is, which hopefully you're doing now, is attending the training webinar and maybe even passing off this training webinar to other folks in your organization after today. Moving into July, so the application preview starts on July 7th, so that's early July, right after 4th of July weekend. Come back and jump into the application preview in Stage. And then you should also attend not only just the ADS UI replacement part 2, but any other fall release training that may impact you. But for the purposes of the replacement project, make sure you attend that July 16th as well for the enhancements piece of it. Market Sim then begins at the end of July, okay? And in the ongoing piece of things, make sure that your right personnel are attending the release user group and the technical user group, okay? All right. So before I'm going to do one more. So for the certificate access to the UI replacement, again, we covered this on June 1st, and there is a recording for that, which I share later on in the presentation as well, but it is also listed for you here. In that stage of production implementation, access provisioned on an active certificate. So let's say you have a certificate now and it's provisioned at the SCID level. You won't really need a transition. So your current certificate with that SCID level access should work in the environments that you already have provisioned. So if you're in production ADS today and you're provisioned at the SCID level, then you should be set. But if you want to have access, let's say, to that application preview or to the map stage environment for Market Sim, then you might need to request access for that. So the other note I'll make here about the certificates is your key store and your certificate file extension change once you move to the new ADS UI. That won't be needed anymore. You'll use your certificate similar as you would to your other applications that you use with ISO today. So if you, for example, I used Cyber as an example earlier, if you log in through your browser, get into Cyber, you'll be able to use your certificate in the same way for the new ADS. Now for the second piece of the certificate or access transition is the RACLs. So if your entity uses what we call a resource access control list, where they group some resources together for access, you'll need to be transitioned to an ACL or access control list, and those access control lists are actually managed in our Access Identity Management tool by our UAA, and so that's what that training on June 1st covered. So that was to help the user access administrators understand that transition piece. So really, the main transition pieces are, if you want to participate in the application preview, you'll need the stage environment provisions. If you want to participate in Market Sim, then you'll need to have map stage potentially provisioned with those right SCIDs. And then if you're using the resource access control list, then you'll need to convert those into access control lists, okay? So with that, I'm going to take a pause here for questions.
All right, once again, if you do have a question, you may enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad or submitting your question via the chat by selecting all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, entering your question in the message box provided, and send. And we do have one question over the phone. First caller, go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
You can lower my hand. I was asking a question earlier. I'm good now. Thank you.
Is this Roy?
Yes. We'll go ahead.
2 chat questions also.
Okay.
Somebody else in the queue?
Yeah, we do have a couple more in the queue.
Okay, let's take those first, and then I'll go ahead and read the chat questions out loud.
Sure. Next caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted. Caller, please make sure your audio device is not set to mute.
Okay. Thank you for that reminder. Could you give us the meeting number so I could get in to see the presentation?
Do you have that?
Yeah, the meeting number should be 826401.
824-6201?
826401. Yeah, we'll go ahead and go on to the next caller then.
Okay.
Next caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, thanks. I had the same question. I entered in that number. It looks like it's one number short. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we were having issues as well. Let's see. Roy, do you have any guidance for him?
Let me take a look, and then I can email Christina if I can communicate with you on the back end while we continue with this presentation then. Okay, and then I'll just send well, they can't see the chat, so we'll just have to verbally if you can read out. Yeah, when we get everything together. Okay.
Yeah, we have a good suggestion in the queue as well. Try exiting and going back in. So basically close out and re-go through the link again. I think it should refresh. Great.
Okay. Anybody else in the queue, Roy?
I do see another caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yes, I think my thing refers to the same problem, but it now says entry to the event is closed, so I'm not sure if you can reopen it or something along those lines, but there wasn't the appropriate code number on the email that I received.
Are you able to navigate to the kaiso.com website and open the calendar? If anything, if you navigate to the kaiso.com, you go to Participate Learning Center. Is also, the presentation is posted, so I can let you guys know when I advance slides, although it's probably good to see where I'm navigating. If you need the presentation, you could open it that way, but I would try recommending going through the calendar and clicking on the link from there.
Yeah, I'm checking just to make sure everything's okay on the calendar.
Good call.
Yeah, we've been having some, yeah, that looks correct. Yeah, just go out to the calendar like Gina said, and you should be able to access it that way. Somebody in the chat shared that with me as well, and they were successful, so.
We also recommend Chrome if possible. It seems to work better sometimes in Chrome if you copy and paste that link from our site. So while we're, I don't know if you want to move to the next one or if you want me to work on the chat question.
We have no more questions over the phone.
Did you get the chat questions, Gina, or do you need me to read them to you?
The first one I see is regarding the dates. What do we need to do by July 3rd, and how do we do that? Is that the first question you have?
Yes.
Okay, great. So for July 3rd, what we're looking for is certain requests related to the structured scenarios. So I apologize if I'm not giving much more information in terms of participating in market simulation. But essentially, they'll be doing some scenario testing at certain times. So, you know, certain payloads are required to see them in, like, ADS is the downstream application. So there's some structured scenario testing to cover those. I recommend looking, if you go to the release planning site, and that link is provided in the presentation. The ADS section has the market simulation list of scenarios, and I believe the requests for the structured scenarios are in that document, but if not, they are definitely in the release user group presentation that I link in here as well. Furtis, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yes, Jenna, I think you covered everything. One more request is if anybody wants to do like any specific things to validate, I think they may want to request by providing a feedback on those in the structured scenarios. Like as an example, for the VAR DOT, if anybody has any specific VAR DOT resource they would like to get a operating instruction and try to validate, so they may need to communicate those resource ID as well as and for how long those instructions they want to see and validate. So basically, yes, those the feedback and all those requests should be sent to the CAISO by July 3rd.
Great, and I think the instructions are all within those documents as well. So take a look at that, and if you have any questions, you can put in a city ticket to get more information, or join the rug and request it on there. So the next question, and Robert, if we didn't answer your question fully, go ahead and if you want to re-chat us and follow-up question, that works too. The next question we have is, when will ADS be set up in Stage and Map Stage portal? I'm not sure if you mean the link or if you mean the actual ADS access, but the ADS application access in Stage will begin on July 7th, and then the Map Stage access for the new ADS will begin on July 27th. Actually, let me just go back to this slide really quick. So the application preview, or that Stage access, will be July 7th. Market simulation will be July 27th. And as far as like the market participant portal being updated with correct link, that is TBD. So if that did not answer your question, please submit another chat question or enter into the queue. And I apologize, I'm reading through the chats now too. Does the new ADS web app allow for multiple instances to be opened on the same computer? So I think we're still determining this. Currently, I believe you can open 2 at the same time, but this is under review and we don't have a final answer on that. Okay. Are MSG resources considered RACLs? No, RACLs would have multiple resource IDs within a RACL. But Diana, maybe do you know the answer to that, or would you be able to make it more clear?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So an MSG resource is one resource ID with several configurations. An ACL, an access control list, when it comes to access, is resource A, B, and C being 3 separate resource IDs. So if you've provisioned access to, if you provisioned access at the SCID level, you don't have ACLs. If you provisioned access at a resource level, saying, let's say your SCID has 10 resources and you only gave access to one of the 10, you have an ADS ACL. I recommend that if you have any questions about your ACLs, you contact your client rep, and preferably I would like a user access administrator to ask these questions, as they're the ones that actually will be managing this thing through the AIM application, the Access and Identity Management application.
Okay, so we have 2 more. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to check to see if we had anybody in the queue, but if you want to keep going with the chat questions, that's fine, and then we'll check after. So go ahead.
Cool. Will there still be requirements to update or install KISO certificates, or will it be user and password based? It will be on the KISO certificate. So similar to other applications you might interact with KISO on, it will be using a KISO certificate. And then the next question is, how can we access stage and map stage? You will need to, for provisioned access, meaning your certificate having the ability to access the application, you'll need to work with your user access administrator. If you don't know who that is, you can contact the service desk, and they should be able to help you identify who that is. Now, if you're talking about the link has not yet been provided. Okay, but we will send that out, or I would stay tuned with the release user group for more information on when we will be posting those things. Okay. That was it for the chat questions from what I could tell.
Okay, Roy, and you said there's no one in the queue?
No callers in the queue at this time.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you guys. So with that, let's jump into the UI. So this is the landing page when you log into the ADS Web SDK UI. As you can tell, it's got a general look and feel that's similar to what you see in the current ADS application, just web-based. There are some differences which we'll cover, but to start, I'm just going to cover a couple things like the browser functions. We'll do that on the next slide. How to see that you're connected. So there's a status down here. Sometimes if it does disconnect, let's say during if they're doing a fallback, you've seen those messages come through where ADS goes down for a second. There will be like a reconnecting status bar that would come over here, and this would be disconnected. The other thing that can be really handy is how to see which certificate name you're on and what environment. So if you call the service desk, for example, for assistance with an issue, they might ask you, well, what certificate are you using? You can tell them your username here, and then what environment are you in? So that's another thing that will be helpful. And then also for when you're taking screenshots and providing those through City. So just note that. So one tip when you're opening the application, and I just put this here, you don't have to remember this today, but maybe when you're referencing back as you start jumping into the application next month, if you want to view it full screen instead of the browser view, so like if you see in my screenshot here, there's this, you can see the bar from the Chrome application, but in this one, it is not there. What it does is it expands to the full screen, and then it gets rid of this little top bar here. To do that, you would click the 3 dots on the Chrome browser and then click this box here, the box icon or square icon in the row labeled Zoom. And then to exit the full screen, you would click this X. So if you hover over the center, there would be an X there, and you could exit full screen that way. Another way to do it is there's a shortcut. You would click on the F11 on your keyboard, and that could enter full screen or exit full screen. Okay, so that's just a quick tip, and that's actually generally, I think, a Chrome tip. So if you have other things that you use in Chrome, you might try that. Okay, now for the UI browser functions, these are just what I'm calling kind of your browser tools. They're similar to when you're in a browser, so things like going back, going forward. There's specific ones that I think you'll use as a user of ADS, so if you're using the UI. One in particular is this refresh button or this circular cycle button. Now for that, when you're loading a new profile, and we'll talk a little bit about that soon, when you're loading a new profile, it'll tell you, hey, you need to refresh the display. This is the refresh that you can use. And actually, I'm going to do a little just to make it a little bit easier for you to see where I'm pointing, you'll use that to refresh. Now the other one is this icon that looks like a little person. This is your user preferences. This is not going to be like your user profile or your filters that we're going to save. We'll cover that later. But this is if you want to change your time zone. So I know we have users across multiple time zones, and these are U.S. time zones, so the East Coast or, Central time zones. If you're wanting to change that, what that'll do is change the times up in this batch interval screen, which we'll cover. So, and then if you wanted to close down the application, and some people like to do the X and just exit out of the browser, but another exit button, or if you just want to try to exit and restart your application, you can do this little door icon here. Okay. So back to generally logging in, some things you'll notice here that are a little bit different is there doesn't look like there's really a way to modify the dynamic layout, and it's because in this Web SDK application, the layout is going to be static and predefined. So the default in the current ADS is the setup for that static layout. You will have some pieces that you can adjust. For example, like you can, we'll move this pane up or down if you want to make your trajectory plot a little bit bigger. Let's say you want to view more columns here. You can move this pane as well to the left. Notice, too, this is where you'll see multiple scroll bars. So within each data grid, there will be a set of scroll bars. So for the messages, you'll have this scroll bar, and you'll have another one at the bottom if you have your screen minimized to a smaller size. Okay. And then, actually, I'm going to jump right back. So another thing here is paging. So if in your grids that you're navigating through, we're going to talk a little bit about common functions between the grids. This is going to be one of them, the paging function. So if you have multiple results that go, here you could see you have a scroll bar, but you also have some paging. So let's say I just want to go to the very end. You can hit that, this icon here with the arrow and the line and go to the last page of data as an example. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the grids. So similar to today, we have the batch status and interval grid. We have the system messages grid. We have the resource data grid. We have a trajectory plot for the specific resource you select, and we have the instruction details grid. So again, or not again, but related. So if you select a resource in this resource grid, these two will change to update to that selected resource. Now, one thing that is a little bit different is this options menu. So in the current ADS, you had maybe a file and, a couple of other menu options in the upper left-hand corner. We've changed this to an options menu within the grid here, and we'll cover what some of those look like coming up. So I mentioned that there are some common functionalities between the grids and what you can do with them. So I'm just going to cover them really quick here, but we'll go through some examples when we touch on specific grids. So the filtering will look like these little funnel boxes. In particular, we have an inline filter and an advanced filter, and we'll talk about what those mean. But those are those little funnel-shaped icons. For adjusting columns, you can drag and drop to the side, so that's modifying the order of the columns. You can add or remove columns from your view using the checkbox or checklist icon, and then sorting, so we'll talk about that. You'll see that a grid or two, and you guys might actually see this if you're using other applications of ours as well, is this pencil icon. So pencil is usually a sign that you can make some sort of modification or edit to the data. And so here we have the pencil icon. Paging, we talked about the paging where you can go and view different pages. and then the exporting of data. So the export of data is a little square with an X in it, and then an arrow pointing out. So think of it, export out. That's how I think of that button. The export data defaults to Excel format. The default download is going to be in XLS, but you can also do CSV by using the export wizard. So when you use the export wizard within this function, we'll show you what that looks like. That will give you the option to choose a CSV file if that's what you need, okay? Okay, so before I jump into the specific grids, how do we look on questions?
So Roy, do we have anybody in the queue? Again, you can raise your hand by pressing #2. I don't see anything in the chat.
We have no questions in the queue at this time.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the first grid we're going to cover is the batch status interval and alarm panel that you had in your previous, or you have in your current application. I got to stop calling it previous. So in your current application, sorry, just got distracted here. So I'm actually going to call these grids. So batch status, interval, and alarms grid. So in this grid, you can tell it looks really similar to what you have today. You have your RT-DOT column, your hourly DOT column, and these will update upon the dispatch. So just to review, these display current alarms, current active real-time market intervals, the dispatch intervals for various resources, and it allows your users to use some default filters. So we'll give an example of that. So these are kind of like where you can see some of the alerting of the instruction and the current timing. Okay, so that should be similar. What happens is it, like I said, it updates when new instructions arrive, and what you'll see is that it will flash red, similar to today. The hourly DOT column and the received status row, so here you'll see yellow. When the time is starting to decline close to expiration, you'll see it'll flash that yellow, yellow color, which you see here in the display. You'll see a little sneak peek at the pop-up message, and we'll cover that as well coming up soon. So other similar functionality you'll see today is, or you'll see when you get this, is when a column is selected. So if you select a column in this batch interval grid, then all the resources with the records for the received batch will be highlighted. So it won't narrow down the resources, it will highlight it in the same color. So you'll see here I chose the hourly DOT, and then I had some resources which were highlighted based on that instruction set. A second click on that same column will remove the highlight. Now in the resource panel, you can also show only the resources which received the instructions based on the type. So similarly, how here you clicked on the column and it gave you a highlight for the results that actually had an instruction. This one's a different type of filter. So in this case, it would actually filter out and only show you the results which received an instruction. So you would use that filter resources bar similar to today to get those results in your view. So acknowledging those alerts and those, so there's visual alerts, which are, the red flashing. You have those visual alerts, and then you also have alarms. So we're going to cover both how to configure the alerts, but also we're just going to cover how to acknowledge these. So sometimes you may only have one column, which, so if let's say you only received the RT-DOT, that one may only flash red. You can either acknowledge that one by itself. We're going to cover that in a second, sorry. To acknowledge all the alerts, so let's say you do receive 5 alerts at once, you can do it 2 ways. You can you can press OK, and then these would stop flashing. And then the other option is you can click within this column. So this is a change from what you have today. Previously, you had like a clear all alarms button up in the upper left-hand corner above that batch status page. And actually, now you'll just click in the column. So if you click in the column, that will acknowledge the alert. So, or acknowledge all of these. So these would stop flashing. Apologize. Okay, so to click just one of them, so let's say, so to just click one of them, you would click in the individual column. So the reason we're talking about that is because let's say you received, similarly to here, you receive a bunch of results at once, or maybe you stepped away for a few minutes and now you have a lot to acknowledge, and you only want to do one at a time so you can check each set of results. You would click maybe this one, go do your next investigation, click on this one, and you could acknowledge those columns individually. Okay, but when you do press OK here in the instruction box, it will acknowledge any of the ones that are alerted. Okay. Are there any questions on the visual alerts?
Again, if you have a question, you can press #2.
We have no questions at this time.
Okay, it looks like there is one.
Chat.
Yeah, 2 questions in the chat. So the first one is, how do you access the API? So for information on the API, I would check with that resource I shared, which was the technical user group presentation. And you could also go to developer.kaiso.com and view the technical specs related to that. But I would review that technical user group presentation on the API. As kind of a follow-up question, I'm going to skip the next question really quick, and then I'll go back to it. The follow-up question, it looks like, will we need to update IP addresses for our firewalls for the new ADS? Furtis, do you know the answer to that?
Furtis, your phone may be muted.
Sorry, actually, Dinexa, I'm not seeing the chat window. Can you please repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, so the question is, will we need to update the IP addresses for our firewalls for the new ADS?
I think we had actually a similar question. But can we please ask them to submit a CDT kit, because we will need actually a little more information, and we have to get through from our IT, the IT counterpart for those details result. So can we please request a CDT kit so that we can get back to them?
Sure. Yeah, Robert, so if you could please submit a city ticket, and then you can also, I would stay tuned with the technical user group and the release user. We'll probably talk about it in the release user group as well, but stay tuned to those ongoing meetings, and then I'm sure if you do, we'll need to post that on the developer site. So the next question was, okay, so the next question we have is, if we don't acknowledge the accept or decline, then will it auto accept? And so that functionality still exists. That is correct. Now, that being said, you know, stay tuned for any enhancements that might be coming in fall release, because I think part of that functionality may change a little bit. So I would take a look at the business requirements just to make sure, you know, of any functionality changes. We'll be covering some of those changes in part 2. But as far as this current functionality, it is planned for it to still accept or decline. I mean, auto accept on the timeout. And you'll see an example of that screenshot coming up here. Okay. Now, there was questions regarding the recording and the availability to view this later. So the presentation is already posted on the Learning Center. If you go to kaiso.com, participate, and then Learning Center, the presentation is already there, and then the event recording usually takes about 1 to 2 weeks, okay? And it'll be posted in the same spot. Okay.
Roy, do we have anybody in the queue?
Thanks.
We have no questions over the phone line at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so on that note, with all the questions relating to the presentation being posted in the recording, I totally get that. I don't expect you guys to remember everything today, so I tried to cover a good gamut that will give you some flexibility to navigate the UI when it is available the first week of July. So hopefully the presentation is useful for that and can also be leveraged for future user guides. So the next part I'm going to cover is the system messages. So today you get a pop-up message in your current ADS. It might say something like you received this instruction set, or maybe there's a contingency in progress. So you're still going to get those pop-up message alerts. As you can see here, there's 2 examples. One thing that you'll note is that the time has been added for these instruction sets, and then also for like these messages here. So in the contingency in progress, and let's see if I can zoom in a little bit so you can see that. There is a timestamp there. So I don't know about you guys who use ADS today, but when I was on the floor, I definitely remember thinking, when was this sent? Did I miss something? So that should be helpful. Now, the other thing you'll notice is now it's in a white background, so it's a little more noticeable against that dark background, and then the contingency in progress now has this icon. So it has a bit of enhanced visibility to better see those messages. Okay. Now the system messages grid, so when you get that system message, you know, it will go ahead and populate that a message came in, and then this message grid will be kind of a rolling window or rolling history of those messages, and you'll be able to see a limited number of history or historical records. But what you can do is you can go into the System Messages button, which we're going to view here in a second. So again, just to review, you can see the latest system messages which were received, which would include your batch received messages and your system operating messages from the Gen Dispatcher or the real-time market operator. And then we'll go into the options menu, and we could view the system message history there. So we'll cover what that looks like here in a second. But to kind of touch on the options menu that is available up here, you'll have the system message history, you'll have access to the query tool, and you'll have access for configurations. And the configuration displays are going to be used, or display is going to be used to configure your profile, the sounds for the, or the alarms for the messaging, and whether you actually want a pop-up message for certain things as well. Okay. So jumping into the system messages history, you'll see this looks really similar to the system message panel. You'll have some filter options available here where you can maybe do message, like let's say you wanted to filter by operator message, you would apply that filter, and then you would get a set of results. And then if you wanted to export some of those results, you could do so. For those of you who do use API or other systems, I think that maybe use the batch ID, you'll notice that that's still in there as well, okay? And you can also search for that. An example of the system's message history, I used the example of maybe filtering by operator messages which have been received. Maybe if you came in on a shift and you want to know what happened earlier in the shift, if any of those messages came out or someone talked about it, you could search by operator messages and then hit apply and then click on view to view what the message was. To clear your filter, you would hit reset. And the functionality for this is to hold data for 30 days, or 30 days of messages, okay? So the query tool. I know a lot of people use the query tool. To use the query tool, you would click on that query tool button in that options panel or options menu. You can query history during this for the time that you choose. You would choose a date and then a resource. When you do that, it will create kind of a little history of query requests during your session. And so we'll see an example of that in my next slide. One thing to note is that the query history will now be limited to 30 days, which we've talked about on a number of other calls. I'm not going to touch too much on that. So for the query tool example, here I did a query and then I did a second query. So my second query, I chose a date, I chose a resource, and I submitted my query request by hitting this Submit Query Request button. Once I did that request, the results show up in this panel down here, in this grid down here. And you can see my result is selected. Oh, this might be an old request. So, oh no, I selected a different date and an earlier request. Anyways, so when you do your query request, when you select a row here, that will change the data in this grid to align with that query. So let's say I did 2 queries today and I wanted to look at the earlier query by resource ID number 2. Then I could click on this row and expect to see the data update down here. There's 3 panels here, so you can view the instructions, you can view the trajectory data, and the MSS-LF instructions or load following instructions. Your export options here, as we mentioned earlier, the default is XLS, and CSV is also available. If you want to export all the results from the particular query, you can use the Export All button or the Export page to just do, let's say, your first page of results. Okay. I'll cover the configurations and then I'll stop for questions. So in the configurations, this display can be used to save your settings as a display profile. You'll be able to view and load your own created profiles, which will be in the private display profiles section. But you'll also be able to view and load display profiles which have been saved as shareable. Or when you're creating a display profile, you'll get an option to share those or make them shareable, and that will show up as well. So let's say you have a partner who has created a shareable profile, then it would show up in here and you'd have the ability to load that. You also have the ability in this display to configure the audio alarms and the pop-up message alerts, and so we'll cover that in a later slide. And then you'll have some options to reset your settings. So you can reset your user display settings, or you can reset your audio profile as an example. So when you're setting up those profiles, we recommend, or the way you should do it is you would filter your criteria on those resource data grids, for example. You would configure your audio alarms and your alerts and kind of create where you want your profile to be. And then you would click this button, Save Current Display Settings as a template. So you would click that button, and then you would fill in the required information, so profile name, description, and if it's going to be shareable. So in this case, I'm going to say, nope, I just want this one for myself. Or maybe you have, a renewables desk and a non-renewables desk, so you may have a renewables profile and description, renewable profile created by so-and-so, or date, or something like that, to help you keep track, and then maybe you would choose shareable. Okay, and then once you've created those details, you would hit Submit, and it would save the profile into that box to give you an opportunity to load it upon the next logins, or if you want to change between profiles. So let's talk a little bit about modifying the configuration. So inherently, it's not a feature to modify an existing profile, but what you can do is you can load the profile, You can make any setting changes that you were looking to do, and then save those current settings as a new profile, and then you can delete the old one. So one thing that can be really handy there is that you can update, so as you create a new profile, maybe you include the date in the description, and then that way you know it's kind of the latest and greatest, and you know it's not a profile that's been sitting in there for, 5 years down, So sometimes those get outdated and you need to, keep those updated. So that's one benefit for that, for sure. Okay. So now configuring your audio alarms and pop-up alerts. So for each batch type, the user can actually select an audio file. They can choose to mute the sound. They can continuously alert until acknowledged. And the audio files, there's default audio files that are coordinated with that. I think they pretty much are self-explanatory. If you hear the sound, it sounds like what it's related to. So like 5-minute DOT, I think says something like 5-minute DOT. So they're pretty straightforward. You can preview them if you want in this test audio sound file row. So that is one thing, but the default sounds, as I mentioned, align with the batch type, and that's how they're default set up. The second thing you do is to choose to mute the sound, so you don't have to play the sound at all. So you mute the sound and uncheck the alarm continuously. I don't think I labeled this right, but the play audio alarm continuously, if you uncheck that box, it will still sound once each time the notification is sent. So if in this case where I have the 5-minute DOT and I unchecked play audio alarm continuously, I still get one alert that says 5-minute DOT, and then it no longer repeats itself. Now for these other ones that are checked with continuously playing the audio alarm, those ones will keep repeating until you acknowledge it. Okay. Now, if you wanted to configure these different pieces, so let's say you did want to mute a sound or uncheck one of these, once you did those check marks, then you would hit update. So that update is key. If you forget to do that and you X out of the window, it won't update. So note that you'll need to hit that update button. Oh, one other mention here, I forgot to mention the pencil. So remember I talked about that pencil icon earlier. If you want to make that edit or that change or that modification, you would use that pencil icon, which would then give you the ability to check these boxes. Now the third column is show pop-up alert. So if there's a particular pop-up alert you don't want, you have the ability to disable that as well. Okay. Okay, so before I jump into the resource data grid, I'm going to stop for questions.
All right, we do have one question over the phone line. Caller, go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Okay, I think that's me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, can.
Okay, so my question is about querying those pop-up notifications. We lean pretty heavily on the API to query dispatch information and pull it into our own systems. Right now, I don't believe with the existing ADS that there's a way to query those pop-up notifications for, I believe they're operator notifications, things outside of 5-minute DOTs, hourly DOTs, contingency dispatches, those kinds of things. Is there going to be a way to query those pop-ups through the API, or is there at least going to be a way to make those notifications have an audible alarm or something like that?
So I think I heard two questions in there. One is the contingency type or the operator messages going to be available via the API. And then the second question just slipped my mind. Sorry. Could you repeat that one?
Yeah, I think the first question was really the main one that I was getting on. You got that one exactly right. It was asking if we can query those pop-up notifications through the API. I think my second question, if I had one, was just more generically, will we be able to manage alarm and Audible alarm settings for all types of notifications?
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so I'm not sure about your API question because I haven't familiarized myself with all of the API. I want to say I don't believe so, but Curtis might have that answer.
Yes, Jenna. So thanks for this request, and I think we also got same request from other participants as well. And we have it in our mind as a roadmap item, but unfortunately for now, no, actually these are not available by API. These are only available to the UI for now. But this is in our roadmap item. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Will we at least be able to set it so that we get Audible notifications whenever those come through?
That's what I need to get back to you. For right now, I think UI also we don't have that option. But we'll see if we can include it. Otherwise, that will be also part of our roadmap item then. So unfortunately,
okay,
now these are not available.
Okay, gotcha. I think that would be very helpful going forward. So if that could be implemented, I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you.
That does answer my question, so thank you.
Great. If you don't mind submitting a city ticket with that particular request, it just helps with tracking as well.
Sure, will do. Thank you.
Okay. Were there other questions in the queue?
We have no further questions over the phone at this time.
Okay, so I'll touch on some of the chat questions then. So I have the first question is there any functionality to indicate changes to words in the day-ahead market that are changes real-time or hourly? As far as I know, that's currently not a functionality, and I don't believe it's currently planned for a change in functionality. But again, Curtis, sorry to keep deferring to you. Do you know the answer to that question?
Sure, Jenna. So, yeah, functionality-wise, nothing would change. It still remain as is. The way it will behave in current areas, it will behave similar in the new areas as well. But I think the question was sort of again. I think we would request a similar thing. If you have a specific example or a specific scenario, then if we can get this by a CD ticket so we can explain more better.
Okay, so yeah, if you could please submit a city ticket for that, we would appreciate that. If you have a more specific question related to that functionality, we'll jot down the question as well so we can look a little more into it. Will the configuration stay with you if you work on a different computer? I think what you mean is if you use the same certificate and you log in on a different computer, will that stay? And I believe the answer to that question is yes. So whatever profile you were logged in last will log in again. So with that, keep that in mind. If you're switching computers and you were trying to use a different profile, you may have to reload a new profile. Okay. I have another question. Will the existing shared profiles, alarms, et cetera, carry over to the new ADS? And the answer to that is no. You'll have to create new shared profiles once you've gone into the Web SDK. So I do have a recommendation here. When the application preview opens and when the Market Sim opens, I would try to use that as an opportunity to create maybe some different profiles and because we're going to talk a little bit about filtering and things like that, and just kind of test it out to see how it's working in the new ADS and for your needs. So that's a good opportunity to take advantage of in those time frames. So that way you don't spend a ton of time in production trying to create profiles that aren't really usable. Okay. The next question we have in the queue is, will this new ADS support change to Windows DPI settings or font settings? I know some apps struggle to display all text correctly if these are different. Some items or fields get cut off, etc. I'm unsure of the answer to that question, and I think I'll ask Curtis if he knows the answer, but if not, we'll take that as a note.
Yes, Dina, I think we can take it as a note and get back to it. So technically, it should work for all browser options. It should support from the Chrome. But I think we'll review more on that.
Yeah, I agree. Matt, if you could put in a city ticket for that as well and just give us an example maybe of something that you run into that with now, that would be great. Okay. With that, I'm going to move forward. Okay. So I'm going to get back out of here into the resource data grid. So this is kind of like a part of our big meat of information, the resource data grid. So it's the main display that provides the resource-specific data, including the relevant times and resource-specific information. So for these tabs, we have, let me go back here so you can see where these were at. So in the resource data grid, we have these tabs at the top, so that kind of looks similar to what you have today. And then I'm going to also point out that, and let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. So here you'll see also that you have this bar, you know, of the tools that we talked about a little bit earlier with the funnels and the filtering and your export button, your checklist, which allows you to remove columns or add columns back in, and your paging function. So you'll have those there, and we'll go into how to use some of those briefly. So the first part is the tabs. So you have your default tabs kind of like you do today. You have real-time and you have your hourly pre-dispatch tabs. And then you'll have additional tabs which can be configured, filtered, and modified. So you'll click into the tab and do some of those filter changes, maybe column changes. You know, if you want to remove some columns that don't mean anything to you, you can do that. And then once you've kind of set that up, you'll right-click it, and that will allow you to rename it. Once you've done that setting change and kind of configured the tabs that you need, then you can save those as a display profile. Okay, so when we talked about configuring that display profile and we talked about filtering the criteria first, this is what I was talking about. So make those setting changes, and then you can save it as a display profile. Now, the selected tab that you're in will show up in blue, similar to how real-time looks in this particular screenshot. Okay, so for the column configurations, in terms of modifying the columns I talked about earlier, you can drag the columns left and right to change the order. The other thing is you can do some sorting where you have multiple sorts in place. So, for example, I have here where I sorted by the RT-DOT. I want the highest DOT to the lowest DOT, and then I wanted it to be in alphabetical order. So you can tell I have two because there's a little one, and I know it's a little tough to see. Here you have a little one, and then here you have a little two. So that shows you I have the first, and to make it a little bit easier to see, I did some outlining of myself and put a 1 here and a 2 here. But on the triangle itself, there's a 1 and a 2, and that shows your sort order. Okay. And I did get a chat question, and since it was on the tabs, I'm just going to take a quick moment to answer that. We created currently we create a third tab where we combine both the real-time and the hourly pre-dispatch. Can we do the same in the new one? And the answer to that is when you click into this third tab, it is actually all of the stuff. So if you want to think about how it might be working, it's that the real-time tab is hourly pre-dispatch equals no, and then the second tab is hourly pre-dispatch equals yes, and then this third tab is all. So you could do that. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so to talk about removing and adding columns, so I mentioned you can click on that little icon that looks like a checklist, and then you can choose the columns that you want or don't want. Here, as an example, I just removed the resource ID because that was a default column. I removed it to show that I no longer see it. And if I wanted to re-add it back in, I would check it and, again, hit OK. So when you use these, you make your choices, and then you hit the OK button. Okay? Now, the filtering options. I'm not going to do too much on this, but I am going to try to provide you the instructions so that when you are participating in the application preview and the market sim, then you'll have the instructions there. The inline filter is pretty easy. It's what I call like the quick search. It's a contained search for specific criteria, and then there's certain ones that have drop-down menus. So, for example, if you wanted to use the inline filter and just quickly filter for anything that has ABC flag yes, or let's say you wanted to do unit commitment, anything that's showing a shutdown, then you could use those drop-down menus. For things like, I took out the resource ID column in this, but if you had the resource ID, maybe you would use the inline filter and say, okay, give me any resource ID that has the letters or that starts with blah, 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 and I would just do a contained search for those letters. I know I use that a lot when I was on the floor, so for others who are searching for resources, that can be really helpful. The advanced filter is a way to choose multiple filter criteria. So when you're configuring these tabs, you're likely going to use the advanced filter more. And so in this case, you would actually choose the second funnel. So the inline filter is actually that funnel, the lonely funnel, the one by itself. And then the advanced filter is the one with the 2 dots. So you got a little funnel with the 2 dots. That's your advanced filter option. Now, in the current ADS, I believe you have something called Filter Builder, and so that would be something similar. So you think about it, it's kind of like a logic-based thing. So you kind of think of your criteria, and you say if this or not this. That's similar to how this advanced filter works. So in the example, I'll talk a little bit about the display first. So you would choose an active row, and then you would determine what criteria you're looking for. Now, the name column describes the name column is actually made up of each column which is within that grid. So if I go back to this display, actually let me go back to the resource just to show you. So here we have all these columns. That's what's going to be in the name column as an option to advanced filter. So when I go back to the advanced filter options, you'll see like I have AGC, I have maybe resource ID, there's SCID in here, the RTDOT. So just to kind of create an example of multiple criteria, I have criteria 1 where real-time DOT is not equal to 0. So I just want, give me any RTDOT which is not equal to 0. And criteria 2, which says unit commitment equals to startup. And so what I want to see in this particular case is I want one or the other. I want all of those to show up. So anything with a real-time DOT not equal to 0, or anything with a unit commitment as a startup, I want those to show up in my filters, okay? So here you can see I also did an active, so make this row active. I chose the unit commitment equals startup, and then I put them in parentheses just for my own logic following, but they're not always required. It just kind of depends on how you want to do your own filter and if you're actually going to group things together. So, so that being said, oh, I hit the column. Sorry, I just exit out for 1 second. Just to give you guys, I thought I'd added it back in. Apologize for that, but I just want to show for folks who are interested or will be the ones configuring the profiles. So I did just include this slide. I'm not going to read it to you, but just some things to think about as you're going through your advanced filtering. For example, that you're going to have to make that first column. So you're going to have to make that first column active. And just to actually make it an active criteria. And then just some other defining criteria, like is similar to contains, if you want to link criteria. And for those of you who maybe have interacted with some of our other applications, it should be very similar. I'm not sure if Cyber has an advanced filter also, but I know some of the other applications have this also. For if there's any EIM folks on the call, if you've ever used an advanced filter in BAYOP as well, it's similar. Okay. So the next thing is the group by column. So this will be a change in current functionality. So in the current ADS, you can do a group by and then collapse the groups. Unfortunately, in this one, we will not be able to support the collapse. You can still do the group by. So if you don't have a ton of resources, maybe like if you wanted to do the SCID, it could still be really useful. But to do that, you would right-click and then group by this column, and then you'll have an opportunity to ungroup once those are grouped if you wanted to do that. Okay? The calculate, so that is a functionality in here as well. You'll be able to do the sum, the min, the max, the average, and a count. What you would do is you would right-click on a column, and you could do a sum. I just did a sum as an example here, and the results would view at the bottom of the data grid. So within your window, I chose to sum what this current column had, and I got a total of 68.81, and then you can see here which one is applied, the sum. Okay? Okay, so before I move into the trajectory plot, are there any questions or anything that anybody wants to see one more time?
Roy, do we have anybody in the queue?
We have nobody in the queue at this time.
Okay. Okay, so for the trajectory plot panel or grid, today you have a trajectory plot which tracks the selected resources DOT or dispatch operating target and the dispatch operating point or the DOP. You'll see it looks really similar. It's got the little definition up here. It's got a little plot. Let me go to the next slide here to just give a better example. So one slight change is that the DOTs will be shown as squares instead of triangles. But you can see here that it is defined here. So your DOP is the red line with the yellow circle, and then the DOT is the blue squares. And then similarly, you'll have the time as the x-axis, and then the megawatts as your y-axis, okay? And this will adjust based on the resource output. Okay, and then the last grid that we're going to cover is the instructions detail grid. So in the instructions detail grid, it's this lower right-hand corner here. And when you select a resource within the resource data grid, it will filter, and actually I should have said that in the trajectory plot as well. when you select a resource in this resource data grid, the trajectory plot will show, and then similarly, this will update accordingly. Now, this shows your instructions and kind of a little history here, and it is default to sort by the start time, so the most recent time will show at the top. Okay. Now, the examples of viewing various instruction types, I have a shutdown here, so I got a shutdown that's going to be at 2045, or maybe you want to see what the regulation or reserves look like, or ancillary services. So here I have my non-spin reserve, you know, with a megawatt value, and then a start time for that. So here, for example, I have for the interval 2045 to 2100, I'm going to see that I have a non-spin reserve reward, okay, for the value in my instruction megawatt. I keep going here. Okay. Okay, so just to kind of review, actually, I'll just stop really quick before I do a quick review of the displays we just talked about. Are there any questions?
Roy, do we have anybody in the queue? Again, you can press pound 2 to raise your hand.
We have no questions in the queue at this time.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so in reviewing the grids, we talked about the batch status and the interval grid, which shows you your instruction times and alerts. You'll also do some acknowledging here. In your options menu and system messages grid, so in your system messages grid, you can see like a little bit of a history of what messages have been coming through. And then the options menu gives you access to go to the system message history. It gives you access to that query tool and then those configurations. So just to kind of zoom in and review what that looks like again, if you wanted to create that profile, you would again go to that configurations box or button. Then we talked about the resource data grid. We talked about how to maybe filter, you know, how to sort the columns, how to move the columns around, how to export the data. You could, again, you know, I didn't cover this in every grid, but if you see that little box for the X and then the arrow coming out, that would be exporting. And you'll see here in the instructions, I also have a similar export option. So when you see those common tools, those can be used, and also an inline filter. So if you were looking for specific, like in the instruction details, for example, maybe you want to filter for all non-spin reserve just to see what came up recently, you could use that inline filter. And then, so after we talked about the resource data grid where you view resource-specific data, when you select one of those, then we talked about how the trajectory plot will update with that resource data plot or chart, and then which includes the DOP and the DOT. And then it also populates the instructions resource for the resource specific. And here you can view that specific resource data and look for certain things that you might be looking for as it relates to that. So I got a question in the chat which says, which grid or feature would be most useful for settlements? I might defer that to someone settlements related, but I will comment that I believe the query tool is one thing that's used by settlements in terms of looking up some of those DOPs for expected energy. You might also look to see what instruction. I think the query tool is probably going to be the most useful just because of the past, since settlements tends to be an after the fact. If you're doing some initial investigation, it can also be pretty handy within the UI to see maybe what commitments came through, to get the trajectory data. Yeah. I don't know if anybody from the ISO wants to comment or if we have anybody listening in from settlements that wants to comment.
Yeah, I looked for Casanelli. I didn't see him. I don't know. Diana, do you have any settlement knowledge?
Which would be most useful for settlements? I mean, ultimately for settlement, as far as which grid feature, for me, looking at settlements, I usually go to the query functionality where it shows me all in one flat file, all the fields that are being displayed. I shouldn't say all the fields, but the important fields as far as the DOT, the megawatt, transition for the transition times, for MSG resources, reg, ancillary services. I find really the query functionality to be the most useful for settlements purposes. Does that answer?
Maybe I should move to settlements. No, I'm just kidding. So, Norma, hopefully that answered your question. One thing I would suggest if you are a settlements user, I would suggest participating in the intertide deviation settlements fall release training, which is going to be July 20th, because there are some changes coming associated with that. So that would be probably a useful training for someone from settlements for sure. And I'll actually provide some details on that coming up here shortly. Okay.
So, do we have anybody in the queue? Just real quick before we move on. Is there anybody in the queue, Roy?
We have no callers in the queue at this time.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so just to review, and don't be ready to jump off just yet because I have a number of slides left, but just to kind of review the UI piece of things. So we reviewed at a high level actually at the beginning, we reviewed at a high level what's coming in terms of the timeline and what changes are coming with the UI replacement project. Just kind of at a high level. We talked about some of the enhancements that are going to be talked about in the future trainings, and I'm going to touch on those again. We also walked through the general layout and the functionality of the new ADS UI, so you should have at least a little bit of a feel of what it feels like so that when you get to the application preview or market simulation, you can do some general actions there and start practicing with it. We also covered functionality to perform actions with the new UI in terms of filtering, sorting, how do you set up your profile and change those alarm settings. And so hopefully all of this will arm you with some knowledge to proceed with participating in those next steps. Now, so before I go into the next steps, I did want to just cover really briefly some general troubleshooting steps during login. A lot of this is very common to all applications, not just our applications or just ADS, but some of it is specific to the ISO. One thing is, if you're not able to get in or access, you get an access denied error, or let's say you're not seeing all the right SPIDs or resources, or your certificate is expiring, check with your user access administrator because they're really the facilitator for a lot of that stuff. Now, if they've checked everything and it checks out, then you can start escalating to maybe the service desk. So your next step would be the service desk. Let's say you don't know who your user access administrator is, or maybe the application is down, or let's say your user access administrator checks everything and they say it all looks good, I don't know why, then you can start talking to the service desk of next steps. They'll also walk you through maybe some options in terms of like clearing your cache if you're having a system login issue that way. When your application is disconnecting or you're unable to get back into the application, you might check for an M&S notification as well. Because if the application is down globally, they'll send out a message for that. And M&S stands for Market Notification System. I apologize for that. So clearing your cache and restarting your browser. So I said the service desk might help you with that or give you some extra instructions on how to try different methods. But let's say you're opening a new ADS message or session and you receive a notification that a session's already established on that machine. You might try clearing your cache and restarting your browser, or opening a whole new session of Chrome. Or another time you might want to do that is if you're not seeing a change or a new feature after patch implementation. So let's say you see a release note come through the customer service team and you're not seeing that particular feature in your application. It might be holding cache from the previous, version of that application, and so you can try clearing that cache and restarting the browser. Okay. Another thing you might want to do if you're running, for example, into pop-up display issues, like let's say you were expecting a screen to open and it didn't, you might check your browser or your settings. Let's say the display is not showing correctly. It doesn't look like what I showed you today. You might check to make sure you're using the recommended browser, which is Chrome or Edge with Chromium. Another thought I probably should have added on here is if you have some experience with Chrome, you might know this does that. When you download an Excel file, or if you download a file within Chrome, a lot of times it'll just save it to your downloaded folder and then show up at the browser bar at the bottom. So if you're downloading or exporting data, take a look for that lower left-hand corner for that downloaded file. I got a question in the queue or in the chat. It said, is there an alarm feature that only alarms you when there is a dispatch change? There is not an alarm feature which only alarms you with the dispatch change. It would be you would get an alarm for the instruction set when it was delivered. So that batch type would cause an alarm. Okay. For next steps, I just want to encourage you guys to continue attending the release user group, and if you're interested in the API changes, I would definitely attend the technical user group for updates. Review those market simulation scenarios and provide feedback in your structured scenario requests. That's that July 3rd date we talked about. Participate in the application preview and stage so you can take some time to get familiar with the UI. Like I mentioned, it's a good time to get to know the filtering and things like that so that when you get to prod, you're not having to spend too much time to create those profiles. And then for training, plan for which ones you're participating in, as well as planning for any delivery of training to your dispatchers. My hope with doing the training this week was hopefully to give you at least a couple weeks. If you have like a cycle training, for example, in your operations team, to get through to each of your teams for at least everybody to get some experience with both sets of the application preview. To get through the application preview, basically, to get some experience through that. For the release user group, this is just what the slide looks like when they do kind of just touch on ADS replacement, but any changes to like the timeline, for example, or tracking of what milestones we are at. And as we move in towards the application preview, updates related with that. So here we can see, let's see, July 7th, the ADS replacement application preview. As we approach that date, we'll be covering items that are needed for that. I think we talked about the link. Maybe that's going to be something we'll be communicating here. But in general, to keep up to date on the latest timelines and any other changes, stay tuned with that release user group. Now, the Part 2 training, which is on July 16th, actually, let me touch on the release user group timing. To get the calendar thing, really to get the calendar information for all of these trainings, I would go to the ISO calendar and grab those. I believe the release user group is every other Tuesday, and so you'll see that on the calendar as well. The ADS UI replacement project Part 2 training, so that, like I said, is on the 16th. We'll be covering some of the changes associated with the 15-minute market energy schedule being in ADS. We'll cover the unannounced ancillary service test, the real-time contingency dispatching changes, the flex ramp up and down awards. We'll be talking about the extra columns that will be added, and that'll be part of the Part 2 training. And then directly after that, we're going to have the ADS DOT tariff clarification project training, which will also talk about, we're going to follow that up with the ADS Part 2 training so that folks who this applies to, they can stay on and do the DOT tariff clarification training, because that will involve some ADS changes as it relates to receiving operating instructions and getting that flag associated with that. So if you've been involved in that for the last couple of years, you'll see that come through in this training. And then the last training that has some ADS impacts are the inter-deviation settlement trainings. We got that question earlier on about settlements. I would definitely encourage anybody from the settlements to attend this. But basically, at a high level, it's to implement a new under-over delivery charge for intertie deviations from the market schedule and after the fact e-tags. So basically, it's going to be replacing another charge in settlements, and in ADS, there's going to be the ability to view the HASP schedule, and then as well as the SC accepted value, and then the difference between those two. So the HASP schedule to the SC accepted value and the difference between the two values. For more information on that, I would review the BRS for this one. So I think in all of these, so in here we also included the BRS. And I also, for those of you who are involved with the DOT tariff clarification, included a link from the last, I think it was in late 2018, there was a training on that, and so you can review that for more information. Okay. So the other thing that we included in the slide deck, and it looks like timing is working out pretty well here. So the last slide deck slide I have for you is just a list of the online references, because there's a plethora out there related to ADS. So the first one, this training in particular, will be on KaiSo.com, the Learning Center. So for those of you who have taken some of our training before, you've probably visited our Learning Center. In the upper right-hand corner, there's something called New Modules, and the ADS replacement training will be underneath that. So the presentation is there now, and the video can take up to 2 weeks, okay? Now, the release planning homepage, that's where you'll find all the fall release or even independent release information. So those business requirements we talked about will be on this page. The market simulation scenarios will be on this page as well. The stakeholder meetings, where you might have found out information on this particular replacement project, was in the release user group, as I mentioned. We had the provisioning access review. So if you have a UAA that missed out on the provisioning of access changes, they should review this presentation on the 1st. The second, or the other thing we did was we did do a demo of this. So basically another version of what we did today, but we went a little more in detail today. We did that demo on the 16th. So if maybe you just want to introduce people into it but not go too deep, then you maybe start with that one, or you can take this material and share that instead. And then the technical user group. So the technical user group, like I mentioned, if you're interested in API changes or updates related to that, I would join the technical user group for updates. And then as far as the actual API information or the technical specs go, those are already available at the developer.kaiso.com. So if you're on that side of things, maybe you're working on the new API for version 8 to move to version 8, then definitely head over to developer.kaiso.com and view those technical specifications, the artifacts for that. Those are going to be related to the enhancements, so you might want to do that in conjunction with the business requirements as well. Now, the BPM, This is more about functionality of the market and, and the stuff that's going into ADS. So if you're wondering what data is coming into ADS, I would recommend looking at the market operations if you needed that. And then if you have any questions about the current ADS, so about the Delphi client, how to use it, or maybe a little more information about what it does today, then you can use these options. But this should give you a good wealth of places to go if you need more information on things. Again, you have, City, if you have further questions or have requests for things, you can use City, contact a client rep. And if you have questions about training, you can always email us at customerreadiness.com. And apologize, I didn't put that on here. So I got a question, how do we submit study tickets? Just to clarify, I meant City or the Customer Inquiry and Dispute Information System. So City is the application. If you are a existing user within CAISO, you could either reach out to your UAA for access to City. You could submit a City case through our service desk. There's also a form on the CAISO.com website in the Contact Us page. So if you're an existing customer of the CAISO, I would recommend touching base with your UAA to see if it's appropriate for you to get access to City to submit those questions or comments. Okay. So with that,
right. Excellent. So let's see if there are any questions. So again, you can raise your hand by pressing #2. And Roy, let us know if anybody enters the queue.
All right, we do have at least one caller in the queue. First caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. I know this training will be on part 2, but I wanted to know for those unannounced ancillary service tests, how will it show up in this new ADS?
There are going to be a couple new columns. I believe they're going to be labeled AS test. I'm trying to remember what the other one looks like. But yeah, we'll definitely cover.
It's a new instruction type.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, so it'll be a new batch type, right? So in the batch type section, for example, you will see a new column labeled AS test, and then there'll be new columns within the, within the resource data grid. Thanks for clarifying that.
And that will also be an audible alarm that we could set?
Furtis, do you know if we're including, I believe that should be an alarm, but Furtis, maybe you can answer that.
Yes, Dina. For that also, there will be an audible alarm and pop-up because, as Diana mentioned, it will be treated as a separate batch. So for every other batch, this will be also similarly. You will have a pop-up. You will also have an audible alarm. You can set it up as the way you would have set up for other alarm as well.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have any other questions, Roy?
We have no other questions in the queue at this time.
All right. Anything else, Gina, or anyone else from ISO?
No, with that, the presentation, like I said, will be available. I encourage you guys to share it with other folks at your company and determine who at your company will be participating in some of those future steps, like the application preview and the market sim. The other thing is I believe we'll probably be sending out a survey, so if you could please fill out that survey to help me improve my training. I would definitely appreciate that. Once we get the attendee list, we'll send that out. So with that, thanks so much, everybody, for your patience with our technology issues this afternoon, and look forward to seeing everybody in part 2.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Roy. Great job, Gina.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.